Next, the Islamic Society of North America's annual convention held this year in Detroit. In one of their sessions, they looked at the influence of Muslim American culture on young people and on Americans of other backgrounds and religions. You'll hear from faith leaders, activists, and journalists over this next hour and 45 minutes.
Thank you so much, Suad. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. We have a wonderful panel of speakers, and we're hoping that this is going to be an informal discussion, but one in which we can really be open with each other and really explore not only culture, but where we as Muslim Americans are headed in the future. So first of all, we're going to begin. Each of our panelists has been given a question ahead of time, and they prepared a brief sort of response to that. And after they are all done talking, we're going to do follow-up questions. And in addition, if you guys have your cell phones, please turn them off. We don't need any sounds interrupting. But if you have Twitter, we're using the hashtag ISNA Culture. So if you have any comments or questions while you're listening, please post those, and we'll go through those and address them as well throughout the conversation. So we're going to start off this evening with Dr. Suad Abdul-Khabeer, over here to my left, and she is an activist, scholar, artist whose work explores the intersection of race, religion, and popular culture. Currently, Suad is assistant professor of anthropology and African American studies at Purdue University. She received her PhD in cultural anthropology from Princeton University and is a graduate from the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. She has published numerous scholarly writings and has also worked on artistic endeavors, including as a consultant for the documentary New Muslim Cool and as a published poet in the anthology Living Islam Out Loud, American Muslim Women Speak. You can also find her on the cover of Aziza magazine this month, where the focus is on an in-depth look at discussions about race in the American Muslim community. A Brooklyn native, Suad is unashamedly Black, undeniably Latina, and unapologetically Muslim. Please welcome Dr. Suad.
Okay, assalamu alaikum, everyone. So I want to first thank Mariam for the great introduction, and also everyone, Sohaib Sultan and everyone at ISNA for the invitation to participate in this conversation tonight. So Mariam asked, should I read the question, or? Here, read the question.
Okay, forgot to ask the question. So what I wanted to know from Dr. Suad is, what is the basic premise of culture? And not just sort of the basic premise of culture, but jumping into our present day and exploring what we are currently seeing with the next wave of American Muslims. It seems as though they're testing boundaries and expressing themselves in ways that 20 years ago would have been deemed quite controversial. So what's going on?
All right. So I'd like to begin to answer that question by really addressing a fundamental misconception that dominates the ways American Muslims talk about culture. And this misconception is this idea that we're in dire need of an American Muslim culture. And the reason why I say this is a misconception is because we don't need it, we already have it, right? We are already doing American Muslim culture. And this is because, culture is about meaning making, right? It's the way human beings make the world make sense. So culture is made in the values we attach to those things that we can see, touch, taste, hear, feel, and also those more sort of abstract and symbolic things like ideas and concepts we developed. So culture is made by living. And so the minute people live in this place that we call America as Muslims, that is the moment in which we begin having American Muslim culture. At the same time, however, I think we also want to think about this notion of American Muslim culture in two ways. So first, we want to think about sort of American Muslim culture with the capital C on culture, right? And these are the sort of cultural things that we share across our differences of race, gender, class, and so on, right? And then there's this second level of American Muslim culture, right? American Muslim cultures, right? Because this plural form is necessary because of our diversity, right? And so there are many different sort of cultural forms may look different, right, for different communities. So take an example that happened here at ISNA, I think last year, right? So last year at ISNA, the chaplain at Northwestern University, Tahira Ahmed, read the Quran, right? She recited the Quran in a mixed gender audience. And I think for this organization and the communities that's attached to it, this was a new and sort of groundbreaking sort of thing. Yet, in other communities, right, such as the community of Manwarthi Muhammad, I don't think there's ever been a moment where a woman was denied the opportunity to recite the Quran in front of men and women, right? So while we celebrate Tahira Ahmed and we celebrate ISNA's leadership on that particular choice in this particular community, we don't identify it as this new thing, but rather sort of a shift in one American Muslim culture that is representative of an extension of American Muslim culture with a capital C, right? And at the same time, we don't lose sight of the fact that gender inequity, right, is a persistent problem within American Muslim culture with a capital C, right? And so whether it's Imam Muhammad's community or a community like ISNA or other communities, we still have challenges in which, how many women are on a panel, for example, or things that are much more harrowing, like the silence around domestic violence, right? So gender inequality is a challenge within American Muslim culture with a capital C, right? Likewise, I think you didn't mention this, but in the question that you gave, you talked about some examples, right, of things that this new wave, you called it, of Muslims are doing that is sort of testing boundaries, right? So you might have, for example, a young Arab-American Muslim woman who decides to wear her scarf, right, to tie her scarf in a gele or turban-like style. And it may be very true that in her particular Arab-American Muslim community, she is testing a boundary, right? But she is not doing something that is new, right? Despite the fact that, so the New York Times might like us to think so, right? And Mariam's laughing because I think I posted on Facebook, it's like, how many times can they write the same article, right? American Muslim women like to look nice, it's like, and then they're in every sort of quarter they're discovering this again, right? So there's this way in which, we want to sort of identify shifts that happen in communities. We want to understand this notion of American Muslim culture and what that is as one that's something that has always been in existence and continues to exist as long as we sort of live in this place that we call America, right, as Muslims. And also we want to pay attention to the fact that there's something much more powerful about a narrative of American Muslim culture that is one of continuity, right? That's one in which this Arab-American Muslim woman is extending a stylistic choice that may predate her or precede her from her African-American Muslim counterparts, than this narrative of, oh, look, I woke up one day and decided to put my scarf in a turban, right? It's like, right? And more importantly, I think for me, the question that I'm interested in asking, or the question that I'm interested in posing, right, is what kind of boundaries are being tested, right? Are people testing boundaries in ways that are just remixing white supremacy, right? So for example, does hip hop become the backdrop to their own fantasies that they're the center of the universe, right? Can American Muslims now claim to belong because just like everybody else, we use black bodies as props, right? So this is my question. And I think in terms of, and I'm asking that question because in our community, and I think across our difference, there's a lot of anxiety about representation, right? How we are being seen or featured in the media. And the anxiety is warranted, right? Because everyone's tired of seeing this kind of, the burqa-clad woman who's being beat, by her tyrant husband who eats babies for lunch. People are tired of seeing that. But at the same time, we can't just sort of exchange this one overly simplified narrative of who we are for another one. So maybe instead of a burqa-clad woman, victim of domestic violence, now we have this kind of like uber yuppie or hipster, really cool Muslim woman, right, who does all these things, but she's still one-dimensional, right? And fundamentally, she's still, when it comes to these questions of culture and race in particular, she still is not, she fundamentally doesn't believe sort of that Black life, for example, matters. Like, these things are still a part of the story. And so for me, I think that what I'd like us to think about, well, the 2 points that I'm going to close, right? So there are 2 points I want to make. So one point I want to make is, so this question of representation, right? I think Muslims often articulate or advocate for these really what was simple representation, what this one scholar, American Muslim scholar, Evelyn El-Sultani she calls simplified complex representations, right? So they look good, but really, if you think about them, they're not really good because they don't shift the status quo, right? So she says, for example, so there'll be a Muslim on a television show because she focuses on TV, right? Now, the Muslim isn't the terrorist, right? It isn't the person bombing the thing, but it's the one calling the FBI to tell people that the other Muslim is the terrorist, right? So, okay, that's great, but no, it's not great, right? Because the only way we can understand or see a Muslim is in the context of this idea that they're a good Muslim in comparison to this bad one, right? And so Muslims, I think we want these good representations, or we want these sort of cultural representations that are better, but, I think we have to sort of, we have to basically crush the pipe dream that if we act better, if we look more peaceful, that the people who don't like us will like us, right? And I think from that measure, we learn from the Black experience, right? African Americans have learned that respectability politics, like, it doesn't matter, you can be a Harvard University professor and you'll still be profiled by the police, right? They will still kill you, shoot you, leave you in the street, blame you for your own death, and then call your community animals because they stand up for your life, right? So these things will continue to happen. So it's not about sort of replacing one overly simplified notion of who we are with another, but I think it's about creating representations or creating cultural production, right, that offers something that is both excellent in its quality, but also demanding, right, and transformative. And so I want to give a short example. I'm going to close with this. So there is a American Muslim woman. She's a Grammy-nominated artist, and her name is Maimouna Youssef, and she's from Baltimore, Maryland. And she did a cover of a song that came out, I don't know, a year or two ago by a young white British woman named Lorde. And the song that Lorde released was called We're Not Royal, or it was called Royals. And it's like, We're Not Royals. And the song many people read as a critique, right, of hip-hop culture in particular and Black culture, right? And this idea that, okay, well, all it's about is money and bling and there's no substance or meaning to it, right? So Maimouna Youssef covers the song, and Maimouna Youssef is a dope MC, and she's an amazing singer, and so the song is excellent, right, in her cover. But she also makes a point, and so I wanted to sort of share one of the points that she makes, right? So she says, we don't know that old, true blue blood slave money. War heroes take it to their grave money. Cotton money, cane money, diamond blood stained money. And then she asks, what about that tax money, oil money, Africa's rich soil money, so thick you can't fold money, British East Indian Company old money, gold money, limestone coal money, right? And so what's genius about what she's doing is she's saying, there is a discourse in this country, right, that looks at the oppressed, looks at those who have been marginalized, looks at those who have been subjugated, right, and flips it so then they become the responsible for their own situation, right? So you Black people, you don't know how to spend your money. You don't know how to save your money. You don't know how to be married, et cetera, et cetera. And she's like, well, what about that cane money? right? What about that money that was gotten through the enslavement of human beings, right? What about that British East Indian Company money, right? What about that was money that was given that people still benefit from today, right? From those who colonized and subjugated people, right? And so her narrative here is both, what's genius about it is that it's both pointing to the particular critique or responding to the critique that Lord gave, right, through on sort of this kind of black urban culture, but also connecting it, right, to the realities of other oppressed and marginalized people throughout the world. And that, I think, is a genius that is representative of black genius, but also representative of American Muslim genius. And so when you think about culture and what culture is, what kind of cultures we have, and what cultures we can create, or what kind of cultural production we can create, I think this is an example, right, of the kind of dynamic, incisive, intelligent, and really robust, right, sort of cultural production that is possible for our community. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Suad. We did just get a tweet, maybe for you guys to kind of think about. It says, but Muslim culture should be cultured through the lens of Islam. Otherwise, why are we here? Our unity means nothing without it. So we can address that after we go through our panelists. I want to introduce Dr. Sherman Jackson up next. He is the King Faisal Chair of Islamic Thought and Culture and Director of the Islamic Center for Thought and Culture and Practice at the University of Southern California. He's also a core and founding scholar of the American Learning Institute for Muslims. He's published several books and has been named as one of the 500 most influential Muslims in the world. Now, the question for Dr. Jackson will...
After that introduction?
is somewhat tied into what Dr. Suad addressed. It goes as follows. At the time of the Prophet, culture was a respected part of life. Can American culture be a part of the Muslim American identity? So it's as if we're battling two things right now. American Muslim culture as it pertains to people who have been here for generations, which relates to what Dr. Suad mentioned, that a lot of the stuff that we're going through has already been done before. Or, you know, what about the Muslim culture as it pertains to immigrant Muslims? Where is the balance? And what is the place of urf in Islam?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah, nasta'inahu wa nastaghfiruhu wa nastahdihi wa na'udhu billahi min shururi anfusina min sayyiati a'malina. Man yahdihillahu fala mudilla lahu wa man yudlil fala hadiya lahu. Wa ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika lahu. وأشهد أن محمدًا عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وآله وصحبه وسلم. وبعد. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. I want to start off by saying, first of all, that's not quite the question I remember receiving, but I'll try to respond to it to the best of my ability. I think this is a very complex question, and I'm trying to sort of read between the lines so that I can get at what I think is actually being offered. And perhaps one of the best ways of doing that is to pick up on something that Dr. Abdul-Khabeer said. And that is that we are Muslims, and before we're Muslims, we're human beings. And as human beings, there is nothing more natural than cultural production. Human beings are naturally cultural producers. And we may draw some instruction in this regard from something that the Prophet said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in the collection of Abu Dawood. There's a hadith where the Prophet says that the most truthful, not the best, but the most truthful names for a human being are two, and they are Al-Hadith and Al-Hammam. And Al-Hadith is the one who's constantly toiling. Human beings toil, they work, they occupy themselves with production. And Al-Hammam is the one who is anxious. And cultural production, in some ways, is really about taking the edge off the sort of cosmic anxiousness that we feel as human beings. This is why the German philosopher Martin Heidegger once said that it is that cosmic fear, you know, where do we come from? Why are we here? Where are we going? He said that is the mother of all culture. And all human beings are involved in that.
In terms of the whole enterprise of producing culture, I don't think that is our problem because we're just as human as anybody else. But I think that we have a number of hang-ups, if I might be permitted to use that word. And those are as following. On the one hand, we are, as an American Muslim community, in a sense, in a transitionary phase. In some ways, we are stuck between a certain sort of allegiance to what may be called a back home culture, a back home expression of Islam. And by the way, you don't have to be an immigrant to have that attachment. Many converts are equally attached to that because they don't know of any alternative to that sort of back home expression in terms of what is likely to be accepted or recognized as quote unquote Islamic culture. And then we have the other side of the equation where we are a bit anxious about this whole business of too readily or too intimately identifying with a sort of cultural production that might be just a bit too comfortable in an American space. And I think that here, if I might be permitted to be frank, I don't think there's any point in having any discussion among us as modern Muslims that seeks to do away with or ignore the reality of our history. All right? I mean, we are where we are today as a certain particular moment in history. And that is a post-colonial moment. That is a post-slavery moment. And those moments produce their own sort of dynamic. And part of that dynamic is ensuring that we no longer are seen or see ourselves as the object of some other's will. And that can put us in a position where we're not quite sure where to draw the boundary between, well, how much of this American thing can we partake of and how much must we reject? How much of the back home thing must we keep a hold of and how much can we let or dump off in the Atlantic on our way over? So that's part of the challenge that we face. The other challenge that we face, how long do I have?
7 more minutes.
7 more? That's generous. All right. The other challenge that we face, has to do with this whole appendage of Islamic. And here I think I'm going to shock some people because I'm about to make a 180 of sorts, but I hope they'll still be my friends afterwards. I think that there is a certain amount of diffidence, a certain amount of anxiousness, of discomfort about the whole enterprise of cultural production, particularly cultural production in what I consider to be that narrow understanding. And by the narrow understanding, I mean cultural production that's really sort of about the use and deployment of our imaginative energies, our expressive energies, our inventive energies, to sort of take us beyond the everyday drudgery of everyday life. I mean, this is, leisure and entertainment. So we think of, painting and art, we think of that as culture. We think of music as culture. We think of comedy as culture, all right? The way we dress as culture. But this to me is culture in the very narrow sense. And I'll talk about the broad sense in a minute. Most of our conversations, I think, about culture are culture in that narrow sense. And when it comes to culture in that narrow sense, we have still some lingering questions. And I think it was in part reflected in I guess it was a Twitter that you received. Because if we want to talk about music, well, what is Islam's stance on music? How do we come about reconciling this whole business of musical expression with the parameters of Islam that we understand to be something that we are responsible for in terms of how we go forth and charge the everyday realities of life? So that's another challenge that we have. And I think, quite frankly, what we need are much more open discussions about these things, because I think that the worst place that Muslims can find themselves is in this never, never land where they're just paralyzed. Mudhabdhabin, la ilaha ula wa la ilaha ula. They're just, I listen to music, but I'm not sure I should. I play music, but no. And this kind of paralysis, can breed that sort of double consciousness that is the death of a healthy psychological life for any community. And so we need to face these kinds of issues. And by the way, it's not just music, it's film. If I'm writing literature, can I use an expletive? All these kinds of issues that we have to confront. And I think that this is another part of the problem. The third problem is that for us in America, when we start talking about quote unquote an Islamic culture, I think most of us tend to think in mono terms. That is to say, there's going to be sort of a single quote unquote American Muslim culture that's going to emerge, and that's going to position itself as the hegemonic overseer of all cultural production among Muslims. And so we're going to end up with a cultural orthodoxy that admits some forms of cultural expression and that does not admit others. And I'm not talking about simply on the basis of Sharia or anything like that. I'm talking about some of us will have sort of cultural proclivities that go in this direction, and others will have cultural proclivities that go in another direction, and both sides will be trying to claim these as Islamic culture. And we end up with these sort of underground guerrilla wars among us as Muslims. And I think that one of the things we need to do is recognize that if Islam is pluralistic in its expressions of Sharia, you have Malikis, you have Hanafis, you have Hanbalis, you have Shafi'is, right? You have Jafaris, etc. I see no need to think that we will be monolithic culturally speaking. And I think one of the major challenges for us, especially as Muslims in America, because if you look around this room, we're unlike, to my knowledge, any other community in the world. We have to redevelop a civics of pluralism. And that's a civics of pluralism that respects the boundaries that define us as Muslims, but also recognizes the fact that there are many, many different ways to go about this thing. And when your way happens to differ from mine, I'm not so insecure that I have to try and tear you down, because I see only one possibility for the expression of a genuine Islamic culture. We really have to get over this. And I think that, many of us in here, we agree with this in principle, but somehow we've not acquired the skills. We've not acquired the sort of, almost even the soul force to really accommodate it in everyday life. Because when we go out here, we see a sister dressed in the way we know, we see a brother, we hear, and we engage in these sort of microaggressions, right? We don't even necessarily say anything. We let people know that they're not really appreciated in our midst, all right? And these are precisely the kinds of things that breed that sort of internal bleeding. You know what I mean? It's like, if I insult you in a way that's explicit, I can apologize and you can accept my apology. You follow what I mean? But a microaggression, a little slight, all right? You can't even acknowledge that I slighted you, because then that puts you in a position of weakness vis-a-vis me. So you just internally bleed and you hate my guts. And this is what we have, in so many aspects of our community. And we gotta find ways of overcoming this kind of thing, all right? So I think those are some of the challenges. Do I have 3 more minutes? 1. That wasn't set. All right. She got a fast cultural watch, man. Anyway, I wanna shift very quickly though to what I think there was another very important dimension, because I think that one of the dangers that I see is that we start talking about this whole business of American culture, American Muslim culture, and many of us take this, as an excuse to sort of, run to our own little cultural bubble as Muslims, and we feel good about ourselves as Muslims, and we've gotten rid of many of the sort of the conflicts within, culturally speaking, among us as Muslims, but yet we forget, all right, that we are a small part of a much larger societal reality. And the fact of the matter is that while success in that regard may change the way we see ourselves, it will be limited in terms of the way that others see us. And when you're a minority in any context, racial, gender, religious, whatever, all right, the way that the majority sees you will ultimately affect the way that you see yourself. And I think that we have to recognize that culture, as Dr. Abdul-Khabeer did say, that culture is not just that culture, artistic expression in that narrow sense. Culture is about the way society calibrates the sensibilities of its people to produce meaning and to produce ways of looking at, feeling, and sensing the world. That's what culture really is, all right? And what we have now is a culture in the broad sense, where the American people find it very easy to believe the most monstrous things about us. All right? That's not a matter of rationality. That's a matter in which their sensibilities have been calibrated. That's a matter of how meanings have been created, that make these things so believable about us. And one of the things that we have to understand is that we as Muslims in America, we have to acquire the ability to have an impact on that culture in the broadest sense. Because if we don't hear, and I'm going to read it and I'll stop because I can feel you. But this is really important to me. And one of the reasons that it's important to me is that I think that many of us think that, all of our problems will be solved through politics. I'm not a political pacifist, and I don't think that politics is unimportant, all right? But if the culture, in the broad sense, of the society in which we live does not change, no matter what rights we get, the culture will interpret those rights, and it will apply those rights in ways that it sees fit, not in ways that we see fit. And so politics alone won't get it. And I want to read you something that haunts me. I mean, it absolutely haunts me. And this is from that famous German philosopher, Friedrich Nietzsche. If I can find it. See, you got me nervous now, I can't find anything. He talks about the fact, maybe I'll have to just paraphrase it. He talks about the fact that it is Europe's duty to prepare the way for that time when the good European comes into the proper possession of his destiny. And that destiny is to supervise the universal culture of the world. And he's not talking about the art and the music, etc. He's talking about the way we see the world, including ourselves in the world. And Muslims have to understand that here in America, our cultural production has to include an intellectual effort that rearranges aspects of the broader culture of America. Because only in that way will we be able to get non-Muslim Americans to see themselves and to see us differently. And we have to understand that all of this is a part of cultural production. And I'll stop there.
All right. You'd think I'd know technology by now. Okay. Well, up next we have Imam Zaid Shakir, and he is a founder of Zaytuna College and several mosques throughout the United States. He has been a longtime advocate of backyard organic gardening, sustainable living, and anti-consumerist practices, such as banning the use of plastic bottled water. He's written extensively on these subjects, along with a host of other concerns. He's been active with a number of relief and development organizations, among them Islamic Relief and the National Zakat Foundation of the United Kingdom. Imam Zaid has also been named as one of the 500 most influential Muslims in the world. Our question for Imam Zaid tonight is that you've often been noted as someone who's critical of cultural trends, particularly after a poem you wrote on the topic, which seemed to coincide with the Happy Muslims video that came out. Can you elaborate a little more on what some of the possible dangers are and what your solutions are for a way in which one can both be Muslim and American without compromising either identity?
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, Rabbil Alameen, wassalat wassalam ala Sayyidil Mursaleen, Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam tasliman kathira. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah. Yeah, that's mindful. So to begin responding to that question, I think that we have to acknowledge there are many different ways of defining culture. Those who've been listening carefully have heard several from the previous two speakers, Dr. Suad and Dr. Jackson here. So may Allah Ta'ala preserve both of them. I'd like to begin looking at this question through another definition, one that's been implied by Dr. Jackson towards the end of his comments, and that is culture as the sum total of all socially transmitted behavior. So in that sense, it's sometimes broken down to the level of symbols, so words, for example, insha'Allah, symbols, heroes, such as our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, rituals, such as our prayer, our fasting, and other Hajj, one of the great rituals in our religion, and then values. And the former three are sometimes seen as informing the latter, but also expressions of the latter to a certain extent. Now, as Muslims, if we consider the sum total of socially transmitted behavior, our society is transmitting many different behaviors and inputs that influence behaviors to us. Some of those can be categorized as distinctly Islamic for those of us who are Muslims. So those of us, particularly those who converted, but even certainly true for many who haven't, who had that Islamic moment in their lives where they consciously became a practicing Muslim even though they were born into Muslim families. Those things are being transmitted to us by our society. I'm here in America. I was born and raised here in America. I was not born into a Muslim family. I did not grow up in a Muslim neighborhood, but my society transmitted elements of Islamic teachings to me that enabled me to become a Muslim. But the society is also, as Dr. Jackson mentioned and implied, is translating a whole lot of things to us that could be categorized as distinctly un-Islamic. And then, of course, there's a gray area where we don't know if the things society is transmitting to us are distinctly Islamic or un-Islamic. And this is something that's implied by our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam when he said, "Inna al-halala bayyin." Those things that are distinctly lawful are clear. "Wa inna al-harama bayyin." And those things that are clearly unlawful, those things are clear. "Wa baynahuma umurun mushtabihat la ya'lamuhunna kathirun min an-nas." And between those things, those two extremes, if you will, are gray areas, doubtful matters. Most people do not know the ruling concerning those. So this is the role of scholars. So to go back to the question, I think sometimes we lack either the proper experience or the proper input from scholars to determine where a lot of those gray things in that gray area fall. And that's where a lot of experimentation, that's where a lot of trial and error comes into play. So this is where I think the issue at hand can really be fleshed out a little, in the sense that we are Muslims. We're living in the context of a society that's transmitting to us a lot of things that either are clearly un-Islamic or they fall into that gray area. And our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he goes on to say, فَمَنِ اتَّقَى الشُّبُهَاتِ فَقَدْ اسْتَبْرَأَ لِدِينِهِ وَعِرْضِهِ.
One who is able to avoid those doubtful things escapes with their religion and their honor intact. So many times I think we either consciously or unconsciously adopt a lot of the things in that gray area, and they become grave challenges to our religion and or our honor. Now, our challenge is preserving our ability to hold on to those things that are clearly Islamic. That's our challenge. And it's very difficult in these days and times. Our Prophet ﷺ was shown everything that was going to be. And amongst the things he was shown was the challenges that Muslims would face at the end of time. So he said, في آخر الزمان أيام تسمى أيام الصبر. At the end of time, there will be days that will be called days of patience. Why it would take a lot of patience to negotiate them. القابض فيها على دينه كالقابض على الجمر. One holding on to their religion, and here those things that are clearly Islamic. One being able to pray 5 times a day. One being able to turn to the Quran on a regular basis. One being able to fast the month of Ramadan would be like holding on to a burning ember because of the many challenges. وَأَجْرُ الْعَامِلِ فِيهَا, the reward of one who continues to practice and act in those days, كَأَجْرِ 50 رَجُلًا, is like the reward of 50 men. Minna ya Rasulullah, or minhum, from us or from amongst them. Minkum, from amongst you. The reward of 50 companions. Why such a great reward? The difficult in holding on. So holding on requires that with our collective wisdom, not with any one set of inputs or any one understanding of Islam, our collective wisdom, input from our scholars, which we are called to resort to, أَتِيعُوا اللَّهَ وَأَتِيعُوا الرَّسُولَ وَأُولِي الْأَمْرِ مِنْكُمْ. Obey Allah, obey the Messenger, and those in authority amongst you. يعني أولي الأمر منكم العمراء والعلماء. Those who have political authority, that's legitimate, of course, and the scholars. So this is a process that takes time. It's a process where, in my estimation, it's best to err on the way of caution, because once some things are abandoned, it's very hard to get them back. And once some things are uncritically adopted, sometimes it's very difficult to get rid of them. And as a community, we are first and foremost a religious community. As a community, our first and primary concern is getting ourselves and helping other people to get to paradise. Our primary concern is not this world. We have worldly concerns, and it's beautifully expressed, and I'll stop here, in the words of the Quran, where Allah Ta'ala mentions, after mentioning the importance of striving and asserting ourselves, وَجَاهِدُوا فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ بِأَمْوَالِكُمْ أَنفُسِكُمْ, and then Allah Ta'ala mentions يَغْفِرْ لَكُمْ ذُنُوبَكُمْ, the consequence of that struggle and enduring the sacrifices that come with it will be your sins will be forgiven. يَغْفِرْ لَكُمْ ذُنُوبَكُمْ وَيُدْخِلْكُمْ جَنَّاتٍ تَجْرِي مِنْ تَحْتِهَا الْأَنْهَارِ, and you'll be entered into gardens beneath which rivers flow. وَمَسَاكِنَ طَيِّبَةً فِي جَنَّاتِ عَدْنٍ, and beautiful homes and gardens of Eden. ذَلِكَ الْفَوْزُ الْعَظِيمُ, that's the great triumph. وَأُخْرَى تُحِبُّونَهَا, but that's not just it. Something else you would all love. نَصْرٌ مِّنَ اللَّهِ وَفَتْحٌ قَرِيبٌ وَبَشِّرِ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ, help from Allah and a speedy victory in this world. Give glad tidings to the believers. So the great triumph is Jannah. And as a community, we're trying and struggling and trying to negotiate our way into finding within our various cultural contexts the paths that lead us to paradise. And that's a difficult process. And I think sometimes we're so traumatized by trying to figure it out and deal with all the things that were mentioned previously by the previous two panelists, is because we don't allow ourselves the proper time and space to work it out. Working it out sometimes takes generations, and we're trying to do it sometimes in 2 or 3 weeks or in time to respond to the latest Facebook controversy. It doesn't work that way. So we have to sit back and relax. We have to allow ourselves times personally and as a community the space and the time to experiment, to engage in this process of trial and error. But as we do it, I think we should be cognizant of the fact that many of the filters that provide us with the ability and, in a certain sense, the parameters to gauge what we will accept and what we will reject, that those filters are provided by the Quran and the Sunnah, and those are the enduring sources of guidance that has allowed a distinctive Muslim community, culturally and other ways, to exist in this world for 1400 years. And if we respect those filters, we will be able to continue to exist despite the tremendous challenges of the modern and, as some would describe as, the post-modern world. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Thank you, Imam Zaid. Just a reminder, we have a hashtag on Twitter. It's ISNA Culture. If you have any comments you would like to add, if you disagree with anything that's been said, please tweet it, let us know. If you have any questions, you can also put them out there. The hashtag again is ISNA Culture. Nothing is off limits, so be as open as possible. Well, we finished with our scholarly panelists here, and we're going to move on to the two panelists that we have that are in the media and the arts. We're going to start with Brother Alex Kronemer. He is the co-founder of Unity Productions Foundation and the co-executive producer of the upcoming PBS documentary, Enemy of the Reich, okay. The Nur Inayat Khan story, which will air nationally on Tuesday, September 9th. Enemy of the Reich tells the amazing story of a heroic Muslim woman who defied the Gestapo in Nazi-occupied Paris. His other nationally broadcast films include, among others, Muhammad, Legacy of the Prophet, Prince Among Slaves, Cities of Light, The Rise and Fall of Islamic Spain, and Islamic Art, Mirror of the Invisible World. These films have been seen by an estimated audience of 150 million people worldwide and are part of numerous educational programs that have reached over 25,000 classrooms and libraries. So the question for Brother Alex tonight is that people often think of culture as what we see in the media. So movies, music, TV shows that are consumed, those are supposedly American values. But for those like yourself who work in the field, what is the reality? Is the programming we see today really a reflection of society? And how can we integrate our own values into the things that we see?
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. So, a first grade teacher was trying to calm down her class after recess. And she looked out to this very busy class, little children running around, and she sees this little girl standing by her desk. And she says, "Sally, what did you do during recess?" And Sally said, "I was playing in the sandbox." And the teacher looks out to the class and says, "Class, you remember sand is one of our words of the week. Sally, can you spell sand?" Sally says, S-A-N-D. Teacher says, "Very good, Sally, excellent. Go put a gold star up next to her name." And Sally runs and she puts a gold star up to her next name. She's very happy. And the teacher looks back out and she sees this little boy. He's being rambunctious and he's jumping up and down. And she says, "Billy, what will you do during recess?" Billy said, "Well, I was playing in the sandbox with Sally." Teacher said, "Well, class, box is one of our words of the week too. Billy, can you spell box?" So Billy thinks, he says, B-O, Then he starts to struggle. He can't find the next letter. And the teacher says, yes, I know. It's a tricky one, but what's the letter that makes the X sound? X, says Billy. Excellent, Billy. Go run, put a star next to her name. He does. Now, when she looks out the third time, she sees another little boy. And this one isn't jumping around. He's actually sitting, his head's down. He looks very dejected. And she says, Omar, what did you do during recess? Omar said, well, I wanted to play in the sandbox with Billy and Sally, but they wouldn't let me. They kept throwing sand at me and yelling at me and saying I should go back to where I came from. And the teacher said, that's terrible. That's awful. That's blatant racial discrimination. Omar, can you spell blatant racial discrimination? Now that's a story. And it seems to express something truthful about the American Muslim experience. But it's also something that if really was out there and heard and understood, you really couldn't look at American Muslims quite the same way, particularly American Muslim youth. And it gets to your question, which I would like to turn on its head. Because what I would like to assert is that storytelling in the arts is not really about reflecting society. Storytelling is about making society. We've been talking about culture, talking about perceptions of Muslims. It comes in the ways in which stories are told. And I want you to think about something for a second. Think of all the ways that you are impacted by stories almost every hour of your day. You wake up in the morning, you turn on the radio or the TV to hear about the stories that happened overnight. You go to work where you communicate most of the time in stories. You want to express your feelings to somebody, you tell a story. You want to impart wisdom or inspire somebody, you tell a story. Then after you tell all the stories that happen to you, you read books, you watch TV, you go to movies, and then you sleep at night and dream in stories. Stories are always with us. In fact, cognitive neuroscientists believe that our sense of self may be simply the story that our brain is telling itself to make sense of reality, to know what facts to let in and what facts to ignore, to decide what is a friend and what is a foe. And we should reflect on that for a second. Because what it really means is stories are the most powerful force in human affairs. And when Dr. Jackson earlier was talking about the way people have fixed ideas, you grabbed your head even to say how deeply it was, it's because of the stories that get told. And it functions with storytelling functions like it would in any kind of context. That is to say, there are characters, there's a plot, and so it's the kind of characters that we cast Muslims in, both amongst ourselves, but also how Muslims are cast by others. And I would like to point out right now, as we are seeing all these, with ISIS and all these news reports and so forth, to reflect on this idea that some groups, some ethnic groups, some regions, when we talk about bad things, we look through the prism of victims. A few weeks ago, when we were concerned about the children who are coming from Central America, nobody was looking at that situation through the lens of the drug cartels and the terrible things they're doing. We're looking at it through the eyes of the people victimized. But when it comes to Muslims, typically we look at those stories through the lens of the perpetrators. Those are the characters that get put forward as the ones that matter. I saw a headline today written by somebody who was arguing, about what we should do in Syria and Iraq, et cetera, and the headline was, "The most terrible people on earth," referring to ISIS. Most terrible people on earth. But another headline could easily have said, "The most victimized people on earth," talking about the people in that same region who have been living under terrible conditions of war and destruction and fear for a long time. But it's how how we cast those stories. And of course, the plot that we have. And many times, the plot doesn't even include Muslims. The film that was introduced, the film on Noor Inayat Khan, is a story about a World War II hero, a woman living in Paris, a Muslim who fought the Nazis defied them and died in Dachau doing so. And the reason this whole idea came to pass to begin with was 3 years ago I was attending a conference with other filmmakers, and some of you may know this is the 70th anniversary of the D-Day invasions. And while I was at this conference 3 years ago, there was a lot of discussions of all these documentary filmmakers about all the films that they wanted to make about one story or another about World War II. And not a single person mentioned, of course, Muslims. And that didn't surprise me because I myself had no idea or never heard of any story involving Muslims in World War II in any way. But then a surprising thing happened. A few weeks later, both my partner Michael Wolff and I were screening a film at different ends of the coast, and we heard a story told to us about somebody whose relative had been Jewish living in France and who had been saved by a Muslim family, in one case an imam, in the other case a family. And that was shocking to us after going to this conference and not imagining a story, hearing two back-to-back stories like that. And we began to research it and started finding out that, oh my goodness, there are literally tens, hundreds of stories about Muslims just in Paris. Algerian immigrants who fought with the French resistance, hundreds of them dying. The Paris Mosque that sheltered Jews during the war. The Franco-Muslim hospital that shot down U.S. airmen and British airmen and was awarded a Medal of Honor by President Eisenhower after the war. And let me ask you all this question. What was the largest volunteer group in World War II? It was the Indians. The Indians who volunteered and served in the war across all the fields of the combat. And when is the last time you've seen a brown-faced person in any movie or any documentary about World War II? I bet never. Yes, exactly. So, the point about it is this. Part of it is also the plot. And the plot that we put to this. And do we include people or do we not include people in storytelling? So I would say to you that it isn't so much, are the stories reflecting with the realities, it's how much are our stories shaping the perceptions of reality. That is the thing that we should be asking ourselves. And the answer to that is not very much, not enough at all. And I'll tell you why I think that is the case. About 6 years ago, I was at ISNA, and I had a little panel where I was actually making more or less the same talk. And I was getting really revved up. I mean, I was really hot. I was on fire. I was out there, and I was yelling at the audience, and I was getting big responses. There was like 300 people. And I was like saying, you know, Muslims need to be telling their own stories. And the crowd was going, yes, Muslims need to be in the arts, being in the media. We need to share our stories. We need to tell who we are. Yes. So encourage all your children to go into the arts. And that is also a story that we tell ourselves that has great power. And it's a story of what's valuable and what's not valuable. The story of, do we really encourage the people in our community to be in the arts, to take risks, to maybe make mistakes sometimes, but to really start to try to add the Muslim narrative to the larger narrative. And that's the only way that those cultural things in our brain, those notions of who we are and who we aren't are going to change. It is only going to change when we begin to tell our stories in compelling ways, whether it's in film or in writing or in song. But we have to encourage that. And again, the tweet that came earlier, we have to give space for people to experiment and to try and to expand the narrative, because it is in that expansion that the perceptions of Muslims in this culture and the world only then can begin to change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brother Alex. Well, up next, our panelist is someone who is actively involved in producing art and culture for popular consumption, I would presume. Brother Ali is a highly respected hip-hop artist, speaker, and activist from Minneapolis, Minnesota. His decade-long resume includes 6 critically acclaimed albums, mentorships with iconic hip-hop legends Chuck D and Rakim, and performances on late-night talk shows with Conan O'Brien and Jimmy Fallon. He was keynote speaker at this year's Nobel Peace Prize Forum. Brother Ali is currently working on his first literary offering, tackling the topics that are discussed in his speaking engagements and workshops. Now, the question that I pose to Brother Ali is that the lyrics you write and perform are different than the tunes of the modern-day Muslim pop star. They deal with real issues right here at home, but there still seems to be a lack of appreciation for this kind of artistic expression in the Muslim community. Tell us a bit about what inspires your art and also how this kind of art can help heal the Muslim community and bring them together.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله الكريم أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له أشهد أن محمد عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وسلم وأما بعد. Speaking of stories, let's start with the question. I think you're right that there is a lack of appreciation and there's a lack of recognition. I'm very outweighed by everybody on this panel. What I bring to the table is my experience. My experience is that across the board and around the world, the reality of white supremacy white supremacy, one of the most evil aspects of it, perhaps the most, is that it exists in non-white people. It becomes a dominant narrative, and it becomes part of the overall systems of domination that we face in this last time. We face systems of domination across the board, of economic and cultural and etc. And one of the main things that we face is the idea that whiteness and everything that comes from white people are the most legitimate, the most precious, the most acceptable, that white people are more valuable, and white thoughts and white ways of being and white ways of living and expressing. And on the other side of that, that blackness is not important, and that it's not legitimate, and that it's not valuable, and that it's not to be honored, and that it's not to be appreciated. And this has been my experience as a Muslim American. This has been my experience as a European American person, raised by black people directly, not figuratively, and raised by the black Muslim community, and raised in a really amazing, incredibly enriching and wonderfully developing environment, and then set out into the world with everything that I've been given, both in my deen, also in my culture, in the way that I express myself, the art that I've been taught, and the tools that I've been given to engage and navigate the world as it is. And the second I got outside of that cocoon or that womb that bore me, which I reverence very sincerely, inshallah, I started to realize the lack of appreciation that is too common to be a coincidence, both in the Muslim world and then also in the world of art. That in America and also in Muslim America, we have an idea about who is a legitimate American and who's not, who's a legitimate Muslim and who's not. And the closer we are to whiteness, white success, white anything that we have that white people appreciate, we love it and we celebrate and we jump for joy when we have a white person that can express Islam in a beautiful way. And we have some that are amazing, and may Allah preserve them. When a white scientist proves a hadith, we jump for joy, we're giddy, we're overjoyed, we're so happy about this. Likewise, the people who Allah chose to give His religion to first on these shores, and the first protectors of al-Islam in the world, were black African people. The king, the Najashi in the Habashi area, was the first out of all the people to actually stick his neck out and risk his political relationships to guard and protect the early Muslims when they were having trouble with the aristocracy in Mecca. And there was a community of Islam that existed there. And it was for a short period, but it was a reality. Muslims were safe there when they weren't safe at the Kaaba, in Africa, among black people. And this particular leader became Muslim. And our dear beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when that leader passed away, he stood and made a janazah for him. Also the voice of Bilal, may Allah be pleased with him, is something that we hear a lot and we think a lot about, just the sound that comes out of his mouth. The idea of his black voice has been cheapened till we believe that we're told that he's the first muezzin because he had a good voice. But we're also taught that when the Prophet ﷺ was in paradise, that he heard footsteps in front of him and he asked, who is that? He asked, who is this, the person I hear the footsteps? And he said it was Bilal, may Allah be pleased with him. This means that this voice isn't just the sound that comes from the throat, but it emanates from a spiritual state and a spiritual reality. And in America, we're starting to get used to the idea that we don't own black people anymore, but we still think that we own everything they create, culturally and spiritually and in human terms. And nobody ever in the history of America here expresses their rights as a human being without using the language that was created by the black liberation movement. This is true in care, this is true for the women's rights movement, it's true for the LGBTQ. Everybody that expresses human rights uses this. And anybody when they're in a space where they have to grapple with their non-whiteness, and I've noticed this with people who are brown in America and who don't always have to wrestle with that. But when they get into a space post 9/11 and etc., where they have to really wrestle with the fact that they're not white, that who do they go to for guidance for that? Where do Muslims in America, young Muslims in America, go to learn how to not be white in America? They go to hip hop and they use these expressions and they value them, this toolbox that's been established. And this is true across the board for everybody. And in America, from so many of the enslaved Africans who were brought to these shores, some were sold, but many were stolen. And among them were great scholars. The name Booker T. Washington comes from Abu Bakr. The term Bailey, the last name Bailey, of whom Frederick Douglass is a descendant, came from an individual named Bilali, who was a great scholar. Among these people were Ahlul Bayt, descendants of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Among these people were descendants of the Sahaba, may Allah be pleased with them. People like Abu Bakr, may Allah be pleased with them. And these people brought out Islam, and your movie that you made about it was incredible, and I love the fact that you told that story. And may Allah reward you for that. These stories haven't been told. And without any significant da'wah campaign, the first people on these shores to desire al-Islam, to reach for al-Islam, to really risk their lives and give their lives to establish al-Islam, the people to whom Allah saw fit to give his religion and make yet again the vanguards and the protectors and the guardians to literally make America safe for al-Islam, were the children of enslaved Africans, black Africans. I don't know how many of us really discuss this, how much this is really seen. That there was a miraculous event that happened with Imam Zaid Muhammad, where people had been striving to learn Islam and to know al-Islam for so long. And when Imam Zaid Muhammad became the leader of the Nation of Islam, and I think it's very significant that I was in Dearborn today, and this is the largest community of Muslims in America, primarily Arab and South Asian Muslims. And why were they safe to establish al-Islam here? Because when we talk about what Americans think of al-Islam, we're not talking about African Americans, because African Americans love and respect Islam. Even if not all of them want to be a Muslim, when you're in the black community and you say you're a Muslim, if you really live that, you're respected, you're treated with respect, you're given deference. That's a respected thing. And Dr. Suad tweeted one time after the Boston bombing, she said, I'm in the one place in America where it's safe to be a Muslim, in the hood. And this is where I got the name Brother Ali, because my friends were selling drugs. Allahu Akbar. My friends were dying, my friends were selling drugs. I'm from the generation where my friends sold crack to each other's parents. I almost lost my virginity to a crackhead, to a person who was addicted. This is our life that we had. And hip hop and al-Islam saved us, saved our lives. And when I became a Muslim and I was scared to live in this world, in this reality, my friends are dying, our friends get shot in the head. And when I wanted to change my life and I didn't know how to do it, and I became a Muslim, this is how I got the name Brother Ali. Because when I would come around and they're playing dice, they put the dice behind their back. Don't smoke that weed around Brother Ali. Peace, Brother Ali. This made the world a safe place. And Imam Zaid Muhammad, may Allah have mercy on him, he was born in Detroit. The Nation of Islam was born in Detroit. And why were the Muslims safe here? This is a chocolate city. This is a black city who's being boycotted now the same way that Haiti was because of the black power that they have here. But why was Dearborn, why were the Muslims safe here? Martin Luther King, whose last words, the last words that he spoke publicly when he knew he was going to be assassinated, and he said, I'd like to live a long life, longevity has its place, but that doesn't matter with me now. What did he say? I just want to do God's will. And then he was murdered. And the bill that allowed for non-white immigrants to start coming to America in big numbers, our dear beloved brown Muslims that started coming to America in big numbers, this was preceded by the Civil Rights Bill. The language and the precedence of the Civil Rights Bill is what caused this to happen. So even non-Muslim African Americans made America a safe place for Islam. And when CARE and when the people stand up for civil rights and for human rights in this context, this is the language that we're using. But my experience when I go places is that, and to get back to Imam Zaid Muhammad very quickly, they had a notion of Allah that a lot of us don't recognize as being part of our tradition. I was just with Minister Farrakhan not too long ago, and the way he explained it to me made sense to me. And regardless of how we feel about him, I sat with him and he expressed his love, and he taught for 3 hours from the seerah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And he expressed his love and his desire to move his community to al-Islam. But Imam Zaid Muhammad, as a little kid, when he was very young, related a story where he prayed to Allah, he made dua to Allah, Allah, if we're not understanding you properly, please bless us to understand you properly. And after he became the leader of the Nation of Islam, within 1 year, within a very short period of time, almost 500,000 people converted to Islamic orthodoxy, to Tawheed. This is a miracle in the shores of America. And we're telling stories and we're deciding what's in it and what's not. Why is this not in our story? Why do our children not know that this is the legacy that we inherit? Why do we not see these people as our predecessors in the religion? Why do we not see this community and not only the great scholars that we have, that we can ask to represent all of us, all of that community? And I'm a European American person, but my community is the Black American Muslim community. This is how Allah had it to be. So when we talk about Muslim culture, I'm just very, very torn up at our schizophrenia and at our amnesia, because I just, it's plain as day to me, with just my limited everything, that we're missing out on our humanity. This idea of white supremacy separates us from our humanity. That's what it does. And frankly, it's the manhaj of shaitan. Ana khayru minhu, I'm better than him. And our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam addressed it specifically in Surah Al-Hujurat, but then also he addressed it specifically in his farewell khutbahs. And in our beautiful scholars, and I love all of them so much, they're masterful at addressing this end time and being very, very specific about administering, what do they call it when you have a disease and they tell you have the disease? Diagnosing. Things like the environmental issues, things like the food that we're eating, things like all of these things, are very specific about it. And may Allah bless them for that. But how are we able to have this conversation pretending that white supremacy isn't part and parcel of this modern world? That we don't look at the sun to know what time it is. We look at a clock that tells us what time it is in England. And that's how we know what time it is. And that I don't know how to, I just learned how to measure, because my wife was at the rihla with Imam Zaid and the people, and they taught her how to measure for what time Salat is. I didn't know how to do that. I was looking at an app on my phone that told me by that calendar, according to what time it is in Europe, what time Salat is. And so this is just all I want to offer, is that we're missing out on one of the most, if not the most, significant and important realities and wealth of strength and hikmah and wisdom and awliya or waliism. I don't know the words, but I know what I feel and what I recognize. We're missing out on a community of walis, and of shaheed. We talk about Malcolm, and thank God, I feel like Malcolm gave me my shahada. I read his book, and he predicted Sheikh Hamza Yusuf. And he predicted a lot. He predicted you. Malcolm predicted you. He said that if European Americans would study Islam, they could be cured from being white. He predicted this. But he didn't come out of a vacuum. He didn't descend out of nowhere. There's a community of people who inspired him and who made his life matter. So when he spoke, it wasn't just him speaking. There were men and women on the ground desiring Allah and living their lives and ready to die for it. In the hood, in the slum, getting people who were hooked on drugs and putting them in their house. And they're peeing and pooping all over their basement until they get clean. And putting them in the shower. And teaching them that your original language is Islam and is Arabic and you're a Muslim. And this is what made America safe for Islam. So that's what struck me. Alhamdulillah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brother Ali. So, something that kind of ties in to what we've heard so far from the panelists. I mean, it's great. We have all these ideas of what's going on with culture, where we want to go with it. But there seems to be a huge disconnect between the generation that's coming up known as Generation Y. A lot of those folks haven't known life before the internet. They socialize and interact online. You know, there are lots of self-made Facebook imams. And then there's this whole new trend now where it's like someone gets so many followers and all of a sudden they're an expert, they're an authority, and people turn to them. So where is the solution to this kind of, I don't know if I would call it a crisis, but it just seems that there is a huge disconnect and there needs to be some way to resolve it and not ignore it.
All right. So I'd like to offer a thought on that. So I guess, you know, it's very interesting because Brother Ali and I are sort of coming at this from a position of people who are trying to perform, be storytellers in a way, and we have scholars and 2 top 500 most influential Muslims. But I think that, you know, I would offer this idea, and that's the following. We, as Muslim community, one of my observations on becoming a Muslim was that this was a community that's culture, you might say, is very focused on scholars and scholarship and getting things right and really doing the rigorous work of that nature. And that pursuit makes us maybe sometimes afraid of, in essence, what I would call the marketplace of artistic ideas. Meaning, you're saying that there's a social media and it's sort of chaotic and people can be experts, that they can have followers. But I think that's actually a good thing in the following way. Because these voices, these ideas really get out there and they compete. And some are hot for a little while. But it's the ones that are saying something truthful that persist. And the ones that really getting at genuine human emotions that stay. And the term that I keep using, begin to expand the narrative. And that's what I think we need to be doing, is expanding the narrative as much as possible. And so I don't think that that's a bad thing. And I don't think there's, quote unquote, a solution to it. I think it's actually a very good way that many people in our community are getting more empowered to express ideas and express thoughts. And again, some of those ideas will just disappear because they're not worthy of it. But those that stay, just like the great works of art over time, have something to offer us all that are important.
If I could say something quickly to that, I think one of the reasons we struggle so much is that we haven't developed, and that might not be the proper term, because social movements sometimes aren't developed. They're sort of the product of a spontaneous historical moment. But we don't have, to a certain extent, mass movements that articulate various solutions or attempts at solutions to a lot of these, bridging a lot of these divides, overcoming a lot of these issues and questions. So I think to a certain extent, we have to be confident that the demands of our day will give birth to the kinds of movements that are necessary to answer some of these questions and to bridge some of these divides, because they're bigger than one individual. One individual isn't going to send out the ultimate Facebook status or write the perfect article that's been peer-reviewed that's going to answer all the questions. To a certain extent, it's going to be a product of a movement that brings activists, scholars, lay people together, and then collectively, their collective effort and attempts to just live out a particular historical moment is going to provide the answer. So we just need to sit back and be confident that inshallah ta'ala such movements will appear, and they will take us a little further down the road. And if they don't answer the question or the questions per se, they'll give us a little more insight into what's needed to begin to answer the question or to begin to bridge the gap, inshallah.
Well, my point is really very brief. Somewhat in agreement with Alex. I have some reservations about the chaotic sort of dynamic of the internet, but I think you are right that there is no ipsy solution. You're not gonna shut it down. I think that though, for me, it's not so much the chaos. It's not even the fact that so much of what appears on the internet is unauthenticated, although those are problems. But for me, you know, one of the problems that really worries me is, and speaking of something that Imam Zaid was talking about, you know, our contracting certain kinds of habits and ways of doing things, is just the utter lack of civility among Muslims on the internet. I mean, it's just, you know, it's just so damaging to the cause. You can't have constructive conversation where the best ideas rise to the top, where people are constantly just insulting and attacking and disfiguring, dismembering people on the internet. You know, and this is shocking. And I don't come from tender background. I can deal with, yeah, I can deal with it, but as a Muslim, and I still remember this, and I'll say this and I'll stop because I don't want to go on, but I remember, you know, in graduate school, you know, or even when I was abroad studying, you know, I'm reading these guys and they're having these like knockdown, drag out like debates, you know, in the books. And all they would say is that one of them would say, and I keep saying, will you tell me who this person is? And they would never do it. Because the person's not the issue. I'm not arguing with that person. I'm dealing with the idea. Right? And they would deal with the idea with such fidelity that, you know, I would be reading this stuff and I'm like, yeah, yes, yes. And then he'd get to the end of the page and say, well, Heather Clem Balton, this is wrong. And the point that I'm making is that There was so much integrity and fidelity in the manner in which they would represent the views of adversaries, that you would almost be convinced by the adversary's argument until they came in to make their own. This is our legacy. This is our heritage. You know, we should not be tearing each other down. We should not be misrepresenting each other. And especially as scholars or people who are leaders in communities, we should be modeling the civility of our prophet. We have to model civility. Incivility is one of our enemies. It's really one of our enemies. And people's feelings are no less hurt because you insult them behind the safe screen of an internet than they are if you insult them to their face. You have to be very careful about that. That's all I want to say about that.
And I'll just add, I think, to what everyone said. I agree with Alex in terms of this idea of the possibility, but I also I feel like we have to be honest about the limits of that space, right? The internet is not a democratic space, right? We know about regulations about, net neutrality. I mean, it really literally is not a space that everyone has access to equally and has access to amplifying their voice or their opinion equally. So it's not that kind of space. But it is a powerful space for organizing. And so while I agree that it's people say, oh my God, it's a crisis, what are we going to do? Because I feel like, when people act out of space of fear and desperation, they don't act intelligently, right? They don't do the things that they need to do. They react as opposed to reactive as opposed to being proactive. So I agree that we don't want to be in crisis mode, and we want to understand young Muslims as a part of what's going on with young Americans or Americans more broadly, right? So we don't want to particularize or single out young Muslims as having some particular issue or problem that's particular to them that really isn't just reflective of what's happening in the society more broadly. At the same time, we have to recognize that all of us need people to help us see the way. And we have to organize. We have to organize, and we have to come together with people who we agree with or don't agree with, but at least we can share, right, to create an atmosphere and a space of critique. And I recognize what you're saying about this question of civility, but I also don't want civility to be this mask, right, for the lack of a critical critique either, right? So people say, oh, you're being, so don't, because I've heard this, and then you end up feeling as if, well, you can't criticize anything because it's somehow incivil, right? And so there's a way in which, right, the call for civility has to also be a call for that does not dampen or damper critical conversation either, right? And these are conversations we have to organize. I think we have to be very intentional about them. And I think that's true for people who, and whatever your specific space is or your sphere of influence is, but be very particular, because to my mind, part of what is not happening on this Muslim interwebs, right, that I'm a part of, but I'm hedging my bets, right, is an elevated conversation, right? People want to talk about people's scarves, right, but they don't want to talk about white supremacy, right? And it's and this is my problem, right? I want us to elevate the conversation, and in order to do that, we have to organize.
So we received a Twitter question about putting Muslims in the forefront through professional athleticism in the media. If we put Muslims in the forefront of these fields, is that a way to become, I guess, more obvious in American culture and be accepted and be a part of it? Is that the way to move forward?
No, ma'am.
No?
I second that.
So should I quit my job? So I mean, just putting Muslims in more prominent positions and encouraging them to do so.
I would say no, and no, you shouldn't quit your job either. But I would just say I think actually it's about putting Muslims in less prominent positions, right? In terms of this idea that, again, that if we just have Muslim newscasters, right? I mean, so for example, we have famous African-American women, Beyonce, for example. She's huge, she's famous, right? But why is she famous, right? What makes her famous, right? What are the types of aesthetic priorities and principles, right, that come out of a white supremacist framework that enable Beyonce to have her fame? right? So it doesn't matter, right, that she's really famous and she's of African descent, if in fact what we end up taking from her presence, right, is a reproduction of a system of inequality. So I'm not really confident that having Muslim faces everywhere is the answer. I do agree with expanding narratives, right, but I think that also has to happen, like regular old people, right? Regular people who do regular stuff, right, are the folks who I think in many ways are sort of a vanguard of that, right? And that's both about telling a story, so to speak, but it's also about being active in communities and community life and responding to the needs of people. I think, so, you know what I'm saying? So I feel like it's not about this high profile figures, but it's about sort of a kind of ethos or sensibility that Muslims carry within their everyday lives that I think is most impactful.
Anybody else?
I'd just like that, if I just could add to that, you know, your point of Beyonce, I think, is a very good one. In the sense of, you know, getting back to the issue of storytelling, you know, just by the fact that someone happens to be prominent, what story is that telling? It may be just telling the same old story of stardom or the same old story of something. You know, it's really about the kinds of stories that people in prominence reflect.
Right.
You know, yep.
And I think that that's why we have to be careful about saying, well, any one profile will get the job done. There may be very prominent people. I mean, one of the things that prominent people do bring along with them is an added multiplier effect to the number of people who are going to listen to them simply because they're prominent. And as Alex said, I think it depends on what kind of story you can tell. I remember reading a sportscaster who, because we're running short on time, I'll be brief about the story, who said basically his father was quite a white supremacist. And when Muhammad Ali sat on television, big old FOI hat on, and said, if they want to put me before the firing squad tomorrow, I'm ready to die before I abandon the Honorable Elijah Muhammad and the religion of Islam. That's what he said. This man's father said to him, he said, you know, I don't know a lot about what this young man is talking about, but you get very few opportunities in life to stand up and be a man. And this man is standing up and being a man. And he said his father had voted for George Wallace in the first election. And under the influence of what he heard from Muhammad Ali, he voted for George McGovern in the next election. So people in prominent positions, I mean, can be influential. It depends on the story that they're telling. So I don't think it's either one or the other. I think it really is a matter of the story.
Yeah, I think also it becomes very important for us to understand that there are certain fundamental principles in Islam, such as the belief in the universality of humanity, a human brotherhood or sisterhood, that life transcends the physical, and that there are some things worth dying for. And I think that was the power, and there are certain things worth losing it all for. And so it's not a question of having people in prominence, it's having people in prominence who are willing to give their lives and to lose it all to be faithful to those higher truths and beliefs. And that's why Muhammad Ali was so powerful. He was willing to give up the fame, the wealth, the notoriety, his career, everything to advance a set of principles that could resonate to any decent human being, regardless of their race, ethnicity, class, background, etc. So if people of prominence can do that, perhaps it could help to move the whole conversation, social discourse forward, and create different types of cultural understandings and realities.
So speaking of prominence, I think some people may be aware that Brother Tariq Ramadan did issue some criticisms of ISNA and other Muslim organizations because they're not speaking up enough about world events. So my question is, if we are supposed to be creating this American Muslim culture and be concerned about being American Muslims, I mean, do we have to take single thing that happens overseas to like DEFCON 4? Do we need to, you know, always be on this hyper alert always reacting when we have a lot of issues here at home that we're not dealing with at all? Are we, are we just sitting ducks? What should we be doing?
Well,
since you brought it up.
no, actually the opposite. Let me say, Dr. Ramadan is not here to represent in full his point of view, and I don't think that it would be appropriate to engage him in absentia in the absence of his ability to represent himself. So I won't speak about that. On the overall issue, however, of us as an American Muslim community, quite frankly, my own attitude about this is that we as an American Muslim community have to become a lot more self-respecting. We have to respect our own reality, our own priorities, our own values, our own issues. And we have to insist that we have not only the right but the responsibility to define our own agenda in terms of what priorities we set for us as a Muslim community. And others who disagree with that, they may disagree with that. That may be a point in which we need to come together and discuss these things. But we don't have to report to anybody because we are Muslims who hold ourselves responsible before Allah. And we have children, grandchildren, brothers, sisters. We have a reality here that we have to take responsibility for. And we should not apologize about that to anyone.
I understand where the sentiment comes from in this question, and this is a question that, so for myself, for example, being raised a Muslim, in Berkeley, New York, I remember when we boycotted South Africa, because of apartheid. I always knew about Palestine, what was happening there, and I also knew about, what was happening, like Amadou Diallo, the things that were happening in my local community too. So my perspective, and so I think it's a little bit of a false choice between, do we have to care about everything? Yes, we have to care about literally everything, because our position as Americans is that we are the beneficiaries of U.S. imperialism, right? And so there was a photo that existed that was posted on Facebook of what's the thing? Tear gas canisters, right? And there were 3 locations on the earth, and I don't remember the third, but 2 of them were Gaza and the other was Ferguson. And the canisters, right, were produced in a facility in Kentucky, right? We know that the militarization of the police in the United States, right, follows and copies the ways in which the U.S. military is policing sort of non-American populations elsewhere. We know that personnel and information between the prison industrial complex and the United States, right, are shifted back and forth between the ways in which U.S. power operates elsewhere. So we care about everything, right? Because I'm wearing this t-shirt, right? Black Lives Matter, right? And I'm wearing this t-shirt, Black Lives Matter, not because Black lives only matter in the U.S., right? Not because there's a parochial notion of what it means to be an American, but because the fundamental reality of Black life is one that's about human life and it's about life everywhere. So I don't think we have to choose. I think the choices may come in terms of, as individuals or communities, which causes, right, that we end up spending time on for whatever particular reason, which may be, for me, a host of things. But there's no choice here. But whether or not I care about what happens to someone in the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, this is not a choice, right? Yes, we care about everything. At least that's my perspective.
Yeah. So this question, I was actually going to say something after this session was over to thank Imam Zaid, and this allows me to thank him in person in front of all of you for making an earlier point, which was when you were talking about remembering that this is a religion and it's about our soul, it's about the afterlife, not to forget that. And when I became a Muslim now so many years ago, politics was the very last thought in my mind. It was a very spiritual experience for me. It was very religious. For me, it did something for my heart. And I sometimes feel, as I've progressed as a Muslim over these years, that increasingly I'm just engaged in conversations that have to do with issues of abroad and Muslim political actions, and do we put emphasis here, emphasis there, or what it is. And very rarely sometimes is the conversation brought back to really what our faith is about, which ultimately is about our souls and about connecting with the divine and realizing that whatever is happening here, it's temporary. We're passing through it, and there's something that we all should be keeping our minds on and headed for. And so I think to some degree, I was so happy that you said that, and I think it's something that bears repeating, because I think we need to keep that sentiment in mind as we regard all these questions and all these issues. You know, that ultimately Islam is about our relationship with God and where we're going. And it's also about this earth, but we shouldn't forget the other, and I think sometimes we often do.
I would agree with what everyone said. I think, and again, it's not appropriate to engage someone in their absence. I just think one thing we should keep in mind or bear in mind is that a lot of times these conferences are places of refuge for people who are out there during the year dealing with these issues, sometimes in very trying ways. They're working with drug addicts, homeless folks. Some are very deeply engaged in these political struggles with their children, as students, in the divestment movement, and very difficult and trying ways. And if we cannot have any spaces that can serve as a refuge, where people can come together and they can be rejuvenated spiritually, so that they can go out into the world and engage it with new energy and with a new spiritual perspective that can keep them focused on the big picture. If all of those spaces are taken away, and every space becomes a space of political contention, controversy, stress, and strain, then we're going to see the already dangerous trends of apostasy, people leaving Islam because they can't find any relief except amongst the Buddhists or amongst the Christians. They can't find any spiritual meaning in the context of what has been defined as Islam. I think we're entering into some very dangerous territory that is unprecedented in the history of this ummah, because the ummah was able to survive the political disasters because it had places of spiritual refuge. The Mongols conquered Islam politically, but Islam conquered the Mongols spiritually and brought them into Islam. And I think we have to be cognizant of those sort of realities, or else we're going to become a very unique community in the history of this ummah.
Well, I do have just one thing. Just because I was listening to what you were saying, Imam Zaid, and I think, torn about what you're saying, in so much as that I think I 100% was agreeing with what you were saying earlier about this. Oftentimes I feel like American Muslims need to give ourselves a break. You know, everything is not DEFCON 4, even though stakes are high, right? You need to take a minute. You're not perfect. Allah's in control, right? And you do what you can, you know? It's sort of like, what was this phrase I created for myself, right? We fight for justice, but we reap its reward in God's time, right? Because we don't know what's going to happen. Well, we continue to fight. But this notion of spiritual refuge, if you don't believe that I'm fully human and you're a Muslim, like if you're my Muslim brother, but you don't really, like how can I find spiritual refuge with you? And so this question of spaces and the spaces we create is one, I think, about politics, right? And I don't believe in some this kind of bifurcation of politics and religion, those sorts of things. But if we do not create the space, right, to head on deal with these fundamental sort of beliefs that still, in all sorts of ways, they come up, these microaggressions that Dr. Jackson was talking about earlier. If we don't sort of create the space to do that, I'm not sure these spaces may be spiritually rejuvenating for some people, right? But there are other people they're not for. So, so that for me is kind of what I still struggle with.
I don't think I articulated it properly. I don't think we're talking about sort of a black and white zero-sum situation. I'm generalizing. So when we talk about spiritual refuge, it's not necessarily a physical space that's 100% a conference dedicated to sort of recharging your batteries without confronting serious issues. I just think when the politics become so hegemonic that we can't even begin to envision a place of refuge, that's when it becomes extremely dangerous. So I'm not talking about any physical space, any physical geographical location, a center, a convention center, or anything, just having the idea that there are some spaces where we can come together and even discourse on issues related to politics, but approaching them from a different premise. And that premise has to do with something you mentioned in part, in that we don't know when relief will come. But we do know that part of dealing with the process of bringing about relief is cultivating a relationship with our Creator that leaves no room for despair. So I think a lot of times we can become so desperate that we will entertain solutions that have no foundation in the religion. So how do we maintain spaces, even while we're having those conversations, that the atmosphere isn't qualified by desperation? The atmosphere isn't qualified by such an intense urgency to come up with a solution right now that we can't, even while we're having that conversation, let's say, let's step back for a minute and remember Allah, and then come back to it. And so, it's complex and nuanced, and I don't think I could even properly articulate it in the time allotted or even in more time. But I acknowledge what you're saying, and it's very real, and there are dangers in going too far in any direction.
Yeah, I think there are dangers of going too far in either direction. And I just think that many of us know people who are personally just holding on by a thread, and that has to be, I think, a priority as well. Now, that might not engage our quote-unquote political energies in the typical way that we're used to talking about them being engaged. But these are our sons, these are our daughters, these are our friends, these are people we've known for years, and I think that have to acquire some priority among us, as a community. Things are tough out there for Muslims. Things are really, really tough out there for Muslims. I'm in a university setting, and I see young Muslims having their deen challenged on a daily basis, and many of them are in crisis. And what's going on in this particular Muslim country or that particular Muslim country is, quite frankly, not their priority. They're trying to figure out whether they still want to be Muslim or not. And I think that there has to be lots of attention, quality attention, directed toward that, and I don't think we need to apologize about it.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, and we will have to say goodnight to you guys. Thank you so much to our panelists, Dr. Suad, Abdul-Khabeer, Dr. Sherman Jackson, Imam Zaid Shakir, Alex Kronemer, and Brother Ali. Don't stop tweeting. Tweet all weekend, ISNA culture. Any thoughts that cross your mind? Thank you, guys.
We want to also say Jazakallah khair to Mariam Sobh for moderating the conversation.